The life of a feral druid can be complicated when it comes to your role in a raid group. Some of you might want to go cat DPS for the whole fight every fight, but that might not be possible with your duties in your guild or raid group. Some of you might want to go bear and tank the whole fight, every fight, but that might also not be possible since you fulfill other roles better most of the time. I think most feral players are in a situation where they essentially have 3 roles, differentiating from encounter to encounter. You either go cat DPS for the whole encounter, or you have certain parts of the encounter where you have to tank, or you might also be main or off tanking for the entire fight. This is a tricky situation to be in when it comes to your choice of gear, spec and glyphs, and there are a lot of things to consider, like if you're tanking small or big parts of the fight, if there are heavy or weak damage incoming, and there might be one or many targets to tank. And there are many factors that have to be considered in order to make the most optimal choices. I want to talk a little about the spec and glyph choices for different encounters. And you might not be aware, but choosing a more defensive spec combination might lead to you executing your role more efficiently and improving your own DPS overall in the raid. And at the end of this video, I'm giving you my spec of choice when it comes to 5-man content. So, there are essentially 3 different specs to choose from when playing a feral druid in a raid. And I'm just assuming now that you have the dual talent specification, because life is bad for ferals without it. So you have your mono bear spec, which might look something like this, and you have your mono cat spec that looks something like this, and some people trade one of the points in feral aggression for 2 of 2 improved leader of the pack, and that's fine. And then we have the hybrid off-tanking spec that looks like this. And I think many players go with the first 2 specs, the mono bear and the mono cat spec, and then just switch between them if they're tanking or DPSing, and not really considering the hybrid spec. And this is just talking from my own experience. But the hybrid spec might be a DPS and performance gain in some situations. So let's do a little comparison of these specs. If you compare the mono bear spec and the hybrid spec, we can see that if you go for the bear spec, you gain 6% dodge, which might be the biggest difference. And you gain 3 rage every dodge, and most of the time when tanking raid bosses, that doesn't make much of a difference because you're rage capped almost all of the time anyway. You gain improved leader of the pack, and 1.5 second shorter mangle cooldown. So if you're going for the hybrid spec, then you would trade all of that for 10% crit damage, 4% damage in bear form, and 4% crit in cat form. So in short, for most of the encounters, you essentially trade 6% dodge for a lot of damage. Improved leader of the pack might hurt to lose if you're the only one bringing it, but that's fine for most encounters. So if your role in the encounter is tank heavy hitting bosses in bear form and not ever go cat form, then you should be going for the mono bear spec, of course. But if you're only tanking a small portion of the fight and the thing you're tanking isn't hitting that hard, then the hybrid spec might be a better choice. And I think things get more interesting when we compare the hybrid spec to the cat spec. So if you go for the hybrid spec, you're only trading 15% or 12%, depending on what choices you made, of bite damage. And that might just be a couple of thousand damage over an entire encounter. And that's traded for 12% less damage taken in bear form, 6% more attack power in bear form, and 10% more armor from items, which is huge and will make you survive in 99% of the cases where you're tanking. And then you can go cat without losing almost anything for your damage in cat. At least in the perspective of spec. You might still want to tank your gear, of course. So with all of this in mind, going for mono bear and mono cat could be a DPS loss for you. And I have done this mistake for a good portion of Wrath. So let's say I'm about to tank parts of the Northern Beasts. So I don't want to go with a mono cat spec because I might take 4 or 5 stacks of Impale, and that might be too much if I lack talents like 12% less damage taken. So I chose my mono bear spec to not risk our 50 or 50 attempts. And this will be fine, of course, but I'm hurting my cat damage this way, when the hybrid spec would be more than enough for tanking the encounter without sacrificing cat talents. So something to consider if you are one of those that are on off tanking duty on some fights. You can join the raid with the bear spec if you're tanking at least one encounter in bear form for the entire fight, like Anubarak. I think many feral druids are tanking Anub. And the hybrid spec together with the bear spec, that might be a DPS increase even though you dropped your mono cat spec seen over the entire fight, because the upsides from having the hybrid spec when you're partly tanking is greater than what you're losing in the encounters with your mono cat spec. So if you're not tanking any fight for the whole duration of the raid, but you might be off tanking some stuff, then joining the raid with a hybrid spec and cat spec might not be a bad idea if you want to optimize things. Let's talk a little about the glyphs, because there are a lot of different setups when it comes to glyphs, and having these ready in your inventory and planned ahead might do a lot for your efficiency in the raid overall. So, starting with the mono bear ones. So these might be your standard glyphs in the bear spec. And this makes perfect sense if you're not only tanking one target. And you might want to swap the mole glyph for frenzied region if you're taking heavy damage from only one target. But if you're tanking one target that does not hurt that much, switching the frenzied region for berserking for even more threat in the beginning of the fight might be a good idea. So there are also encounters where you really don't want taunt to resist. So swapping in the taunt glyph for this fight is excellent. So if the fight is only a single target without that much incoming damage, having the mango glyph might make sense. But if the damage is high, swapping it for frenzied region might be a better idea. And if you're tanking more than one target and your taunt can't resist, then the mole glyph might be a good choice. So for the mono cat glyphs, that really isn't much to talk about. You have your 3 standard ones that are pretty much always your best choices. The special situation that might occur is when you cannot hit the target from behind, and therefore you might not be able to shred. So in these situations you have 2 choices. You either swap your shred for rip if the encounter is purely single target. But if there are more targets, like the Kologarnix encounter in Ulduar, then berserk might be a good glyph to get more swipes out. So lastly then, for the off tanking. So if you're off tanking the fight and you're going cat for parts of the encounter, you also have a few things to consider when it comes to the glyphs. If you're only tanking a single target and the incoming damage is high during that encounter, like Algalon, then these glyphs are a good choice. Even though on Algalon you might want to go full bear spec and all defensive glyphs if you're not geared to the teeth. So if you're only briefly tanking, or the thing you're tanking ain't hitting that hard, then swapping survival instincts to shred might be okay. But if you're tanking more targets and those targets hurt, like ads in the phase 3 of the Yogg Saron encounter, then these glyphs are better. And if you're tanking multiple weak targets, then you might want to swap the survival instincts for Savage Roar to gain more cat damage. So my advice for you is to plan your raid ahead of time, and knowing what spec and glyphs are best for each encounter. You should write it down and make the appropriate swaps before reaching each boss. Because you having a few seconds of downtime during trash takes up less damage for the raid than everyone having to wait for you to sort this stuff out before the pull when all the trash is dead and everyone is waiting to pull the boss. So the last thing I want to talk about is 5-man content. And of course, if you're only doing a quick daily for batches, then you shouldn't sweat it. Just go with the best suited spec you have for the moment and just get it over with. But you might want to consider this if you're going on a world tour, let's say, or you're lucky enough to only go monocat during raids and have a spare spec only for 5-man counters. So that spec would look something like this. So you're trading 1.5 seconds of mangle cooldown, and mangle, you're hardly using mangle anyways in 5-mans where you're pulling a lot of mobs, and you're also trading improved leader of the pack, that is far from mandatory in 5-mans, for more bear damage with master shapeshifter. And the glyphs would be as offensive as possible, like these ones. So if you made it this far, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.